They didn't notice the flicker in the lighting grid or the subtle shift in acoustic tone. No one paused their conversations or glanced up from their flutes of vintage Chenin. But the insult landed clean, crisp as glass under pressure. "Excuse me, housekeeping," drifted across the opalescent air of Kingsport Atrium, trailing a ripple of indulgent chuckles behind it. Naomi Ellington didn't flinch. She didn't ask for recognition. No logos adorned her dress. No nameplate shimmered from her wrist. Just a streamlined indigo sheath and a leather-bound tablet clasped calmly in her hand. Her expression didn't register surprise or offense. It simply held. Her gaze settled on the speaker, a woman in red silk and pearls, her laugh practiced, her smugness polished by generational insulation. Around her, tailored men leaned in as if to enjoy the show. One raised his coupe glass in mock cheer. "Didn't know this was open to service tonight," he quipped, letting the joke linger. Another murmured, "Bit far from the staff corridor, aren't you?" Naomi said nothing. She didn't correct, didn't apologize. Her thumb swiped once across her screen, fluid, deliberate. She didn't demand acknowledgement. Her clarity didn't need it. Across the atrium, a junior associate at the photography station paused mid-shot. Something about Naomi's posture stilled the frame. The music continued, slower now, uncertain. The room hadn't gone silent, but something within it had begun to listen. Naomi stood rooted, not out of confusion or hesitation, but like a fixed point around which the rest had started to orbit without knowing why. Her shoulders relaxed, her eyes never drifted. She wasn't demanding attention. She was commanding gravity. She hadn't spoken, she hadn't needed to, and yet already the atmosphere had shifted. Inside the discreet casing of her earpiece, a soft voice whispered, "Preliminary withdrawals confirmed. Do you want to proceed?" Naomi's index finger tapped once. There was no sound, only consequence. At that same moment, Elliot Shen, mid-shift, mid-tray, passed behind the woman in red. He paused, just half a step, as his gaze caught Naomi's face and the screen's brief illumination. It wasn't fear or recognition. It was instinct. He didn't know her, but he knew something was shifting, and he didn't want to be the last to realize it. No one else noticed his hesitation, but the pause became part of the room's rhythm. Vivian Durrell smirked wider, assuming victory, but Naomi's silence wasn't retreat. It was the prelude. Behind Naomi, a line of string players continued their set, but the harmony had changed. Notes now felt precarious, like they understood the room no longer belonged to ceremony, but to calculation, and standing dead center of it all was a woman whose quiet presence had begun to disrupt the choreography of power. No badge, no introduction, no raised voice, just an unread tablet, an undisturbed gaze, and a quiet decision already in motion. It didn't begin with a bang. It never does, not in rooms like this, where affluence moves behind glass and manners are forged into armor, where expressions are rehearsed and nothing unscripted is ever supposed to matter. But in the seconds after Naomi Ellington remained unmoved, after the laughter had tried and failed to expand, something quiet and uncomfortable began to stretch beneath the crystal glow elegance of the Kingsport Atrium. It was in the way a conversation faltered mid-sentence at a table not far from the bar, two partners from a shipping conglomerate hesitating over whether to mention Naomi at all, uncertain now if the joke had, in fact, been a miscalculation. It lingered in the softened tempo of the quartet, where one cello dragged slightly behind the beat, her eyes glancing not toward her sheet music but toward the woman in indigo who hadn't said a single word. People didn't stop what they were doing, not yet, but their gestures, their movements, their tones, all began to subtly lose the ease they had worn like second skin when they arrived. The music hadn't stopped, but it no longer filled the air with confidence. The laughter still echoed in corners, but with a brittleness that made it feel closer to static than celebration. Near the central orchid sculpture, a hedge fund advisor adjusted his cufflink twice in under a minute. Not for function, not for fashion, but because his instincts, those finely honed, market-calibrated instincts, told him something beneath the evening's surface had gone off script. The atmosphere, once firm and self-assured, was beginning to feel textured with something unfamiliar, the slow, invisible crawl of accountability. And Naomi still hadn't moved. Her body remained angled toward the woman in red, but her attention had long since surpassed her. She was not assessing Vivian Durrell. She was studying the room, mapping how influence responded to imbalance, how institutions disguised in cocktails and couture revealed their values in the seconds after a disruption. Kira Dominguez, still clutching her press badge and editorial tablet, found herself abandoning the floral layout she'd been assigned to photograph. She didn't know who Naomi Ellington was, but the way conversations redirected themselves, the way glances lingered a second too long, told her one thing. This woman was not part of the decoration. She was not part of the oversight. She was the axis now, and the lens needed to find her before the story disappeared beneath velvet and perfume. Even the waitstaff had begun to feel the shift. Elliot Shen's pace slowed slightly each time he circled the central lounge, not from fatigue, but from caution, as if each pass might reveal a new fault line in the polished marble of the evening's agenda. Jamal Pryor, head of the private security detail stationed near the atrium's south entrance, had adjusted his stance twice since Naomi's stillness took hold. His eyes weren't trained on any one individual, but on the flow itself, the way it moved, the way it now bent around a presence no one had invited to command attention, yet who held it without contest. And still, no one had spoken to Naomi since the insult. They didn't know what to say, because some part of them, the part beneath their curated grins and seasonal etiquette, understood that what she represented wasn't an accident or anomaly. It was intention. It was the quiet certainty of someone who knew not just where she was, but why she had chosen to be there. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't identified herself. And yet she had already begun to redraw the map of the room, quietly, mercilessly, without needing permission. From the raised edge of the central staircase, Vivian Durrell descended with the kind of precision that suggested she had timed the moment. Her heels struck the marble not with aggression, but with the theatrical restraint of someone who believed presence alone was enough to restore order. She didn't need to raise her chin. The room had already been conditioned to part when she approached, to glance up not out of admiration, but out of obligation. In her hand, delicately pinched between two fingers polished to a mirror sheen, fluttered the torn remains of a guest program. Its edge was ragged, the split diagonal, deliberately dramatic. The top half, adorned with the gilded seal of Durrell Hawthorne Capital, caught the light. The lower half, the half bearing Naomi's name and access credentials, had been cleanly separated, shredded, as if it had never been legitimate in the first place. She didn't speak. Not yet. She didn't need to. Instead, she raised the scrap just high enough for the guests nearby to see, her motions slow and deliberate, the gesture less about making a point and more about framing an image, one designed to circulate in whispers before any explanation could attach itself. The message behind the paper wasn't subtle. This woman doesn't belong. And for a brief, suspended moment, Vivienne believed the room would comply. But Naomi didn't blink. She didn't acknowledge the paper or the woman holding it. Her gaze remained steady, not confrontational, not dismissive, simply unyielding. The kind of gaze that made people question whether they'd just exposed the wrong person, whether their gesture had revealed strength or insecurity. Across the floor, Kira Dominguez widened her camera angle. She no longer focused solely on Naomi. She captured the entire tableau now. Vivienne's calculated posture, the shredded paper, the semicircle of elegant discomfort surrounding them, and the stillness at its core. It wasn't a confrontation. Not yet. But it had become something worse for Vivian. A moment she couldn't control. Jamal Pryor watched from the periphery. His hand moved to his radio, not to call for backup, but because decades in quiet enforcement had taught him how to read social temperature, and this one had begun to turn. Not hot, not loud, but sharp. Cold in the way metal felt before a storm. Still, no one moved. No one dared interrupt. Then, at last, Vivian spoke. "This is a private gathering," she said, each syllable dipped in the kind of condescension reserved for old institutions and closed circles. "Not open for observation." She didn't raise her voice, but the implication coiled beneath her tone like a trap. Naomi was not on the list. Naomi was a mistake. Naomi didn't respond. She didn't move. But something in the crowd did. A subtle lean, a quiet repositioning. Someone turned just slightly toward the sound, not to listen, but to see who else was watching. The shift wasn't about solidarity. Not yet. It was about alignment, about not being on the wrong side of whatever this was becoming. And Naomi, unchanged, unreadable, remained exactly where she had chosen to stand, as if Vivian's entire performance hadn't altered a single variable in her calculation. If Vivian Durrell had intended to reclaim the narrative, she had just learned that stories don't always wait for permission to change direction. It wasn't the kind of scene that triggered immediate intervention. There were no raised voices, no clinking of glass from a dropped tray, no break in decorum sharp enough to alert a security protocol. But somehow, the very absence of noise had become its own warning sign, a subtle alarm encoded into the stillness that now wrapped itself around Naomi Ellington like an invisible perimeter. Jamal Pryor didn't move, but he watched with increasing precision, his body instinctively tilting to accommodate a better line of sight. Not toward Vivian Durrell, not toward the scrap of paper still fluttering slightly between her fingers, but toward the faces in the crowd, the ones that had stopped blinking as often, the ones whose gazes no longer followed the event's decorative centerpieces, but instead hovered just slightly, and then quite purposefully, in Naomi's direction. On the other side of the atrium, Mason Durrell appeared, not with the urgency of someone resolving a conflict, but with the quiet confidence of a man who believed that his arrival alone would be enough to stabilize the moment, to reassert hierarchy by the sheer weight of familiarity, by the gravity of expectation that the room had always afforded him without question. He didn't look at his wife. He didn't address her raised hand or the program it held like a misplaced scepter. He looked directly at Naomi. And when he spoke, his voice was neither loud nor cruel. It was refined, lowered to that almost whispery register men in long-tenured power use, when they want to remind others that they are accustomed to finishing conversations before others realize they've started. "I believe you're in the wrong section," he said, his tone soft, his diction perfect, his expression unreadable, not because it lacked emotion, but because it had been practiced out of muscle memory. This was not a man accustomed to being questioned, especially not in his own curated sanctum. But the moment he finished speaking, something slipped, unseen yet undeniable. A nearby conversation faltered, the bartender's hands stilled, and the violinist missed a beat. Attention shifting toward the space between Naomi and the Durrells. Naomi still hadn't spoken. Her silence had become structural, a mirror forcing others to confront their own assumptions. Vivian lowered the torn program, no longer proof but evidence of misjudgment. Naomi tilted her tablet slightly, its glow catching the chandelier light with quiet precision. Behind her, Kira Dominguez kept filming. Not ambience, but power exposed. No sound broke the scene, yet everything had shifted. Naomi's presence was no longer about confrontation. She had disrupted the pattern. It began not with spectacle, not with declaration or display, but with a gesture so small it would have gone unnoticed in any other context, a barely perceptible tap of Naomi Ellington's index finger against the edge of her tablet, one that neither illuminated the screen further nor altered her expression, but which triggered, through encrypted channels and redundant safeguards, a cascade of decisions that had been months in the making, each one calibrated not to disrupt attention, but to render attention obsolete. On the other end of her earpiece, a calm voice responded, low enough to be inaudible to anyone nearby, but with just enough gravity to match the moment. Phase 1 complete. Transition protocols verified. Redirect underway. Awaiting your final mark. She didn't give it immediately. She didn't need to, because the room, long before it knew what had been set in motion, had already begun to act as if it had felt something shifting in its architecture. Something not quite visible but deeply understood, like the pressure drop before a storm, like the weightless pause between cause and consequence. A few feet away, the director of coastal accounts at Everlane Freight shifted slightly in his polished wingtip shoes, not because he had heard anything unusual, but because his phone, set to vibrate in the inner pocket of his jacket, had just buzzed once, then again, each time a silent whisper of market movement that told him, without language, that someone with influence had just altered course. And across the floor, seated at a corner table designed to suggest social importance without the inconvenience of proximity, a managing partner from a rival fund reached for his phone not to text or call, but simply to stare, brows furrowed, thumb hovering, as his feed refreshed with a silent update he hadn't anticipated and hadn't prepared to explain. Still, Naomi stood in place. Still, she said nothing. But the illusion of stasis had been broken. In corners of the room, people who had never once questioned the layout of this space, the order of its tables, the alignment of its sightlines, now found themselves glancing not toward the stage, not toward the program schedule embossed on thick white linen, but toward Naomi, the woman who had not moved since entering, and yet around whom the evening had begun to revolve with a precision that felt closer to inevitability than chance. Vivian Durrell lowered her hand fully now, the program piece forgotten, fingers tightening slightly, not out of threat, but out of something far more destabilizing. The realization that whatever battle she thought she was orchestrating had, in fact, already been concluded before she even entered the fray. And Mason, his smirk long gone, his stance now measured and slow, did not look to his wife for reinforcement, nor to his colleagues for social alignment, but instead let his gaze settle again on Naomi, and in that gaze was something quieter than panic, but far more consequential. Calculation, giving way to awareness. Jamal Pryor didn't need orders. He knew silence could weigh more than force, and Naomi's stillness had become gravity. With a final tap, she gave the word, "Proceed." Her earpiece replied. Full withdrawal in motion, compliance synced, Margrave dependency dissolved. Naomi's face didn't change, but the room had. Not through confrontation, through control. It started at the edges, where collapses always begin. A junior strategist checked her phone and froze at the headline. Lansbury Vaughan Capital confirmed as replacement partner. Transfers finalized. Effective immediately. No scandal, no drama, just precision. And in this world, precision was enough to spark realignment. Across the floor, a glass lowered unfinished as dashboards updated. Durrell Hawthorne's line didn't crash. It unraveled, flattening with the quiet logic of capital retreat. Vivian Durrell stood motionless beneath the central light array. The paper in her hand, once held like a shield, now drooped slightly at the corner. No longer symbolic, no longer useful. She hadn't moved. But the illusion that she might still control the narrative had already expired. And though her chin remained high, the tendons in her neck had begun to betray her, subtle tension accumulating with nowhere to exit. Mason Durrell stayed silent. He knew the shift had already happened, the room no longer his to influence. Naomi hadn't raised her voice or asked for acknowledgement, yet she had done what few ever manage, removed power without spectacle. And already, the room's gaze was shifting. Near the mezzanine, Harriet Vaughan appeared, her presence alone enough to signal Lansbury Vaughan wasn't arriving. They were already here. Phones lit up, not to record but to track collapsing deals and restructured alliances. Naomi wasn't curiosity anymore, she was gravity. The moment wasn't loud, but it was final. By the time the quartet faltered and trays were cleared, the atrium had changed without chaos. Its loyalties quietly rearranged around a new center. Through it all, Naomi never moved. She didn't need to. Real power doesn't reposition when others are already rotating in response. The room's language shifted, postures adjusted, conversations bent mid-sentence. No one asked, "What do the Durrells think?" anymore. The question had become, "Where does Ellington stand?" Harriet Vaughn moved through the space without hurry. She didn't announce the change. She embodied it, confirming Lansbury Vaughn was no longer waiting to enter. They were already here. In the back, Kira Dominguez kept recording. It wasn't drama she captured, but narrative. Naomi had made it impossible not to. Mason stayed, though his posture betrayed regret. Vivian lingered, reduced to a woman holding a torn program no one cared about. Then silence gave way to assent. 33 floors above the atrium, Naomi entered a boardroom stripped of ceremony. No applause, no speeches, just executives already aligned. The data glowed across black glass, capital redirected, compliance prepared, partners onboarded. No one asked for confirmation. The shift had already happened. She reviewed, signed, approved, with the same calm her silence had carried below. No press statement, no industry quote. The market had already answered. The Durrells were tomorrow's lesson, not today's topic. Beyond the glass, the city glowed like circuitry, cars pulsing along its veins. Naomi didn't look out. She wasn't watching the skyline, but the structure beneath it. On her desk lay the torn program, flattened beneath glass. Not ceremony, not anger, just proof. Some systems collapse not when attacked, but when someone quietly stops holding them up. She didn't linger. No speeches, no follow-ups. Her team already moved with the rhythm she had set. Naomi Ellington had never come to perform. She had come to correct. This isn't a story about spectacle or revenge. It's about the kind of correction that doesn't seek recognition, because it never needed permission. Silence can be authority. Presence doesn't need to be loud to be permanent. If this fictional story resonates, if you've ever been underestimated or written out, you know, true influence doesn't announce itself. It just moves, decisively, calmly, and by the time it's finished, the room is never the same. Subscribe if this speaks to you. Here we don't chase noise, we follow the shift. Power moves differently here. Stillness is strength. Rules are rewritten not with volume, but with vision.
Still.